There you go. Hello, everybody. My name is Peter Byck, and I am a professor of practice at Arizona State University. And what that means is I didn't come up through the academic world. I came up through the film world, and then they said, hey, why don't you do what you do over here? And I also run a 501c3 called Carbon Nation. And so when I made Carbon Nation, it was a film about solutions to climate change. And in the making of that film, we were kind of confused as to whether cows were a good thing or a bad thing. We said Meatless Mondays was a good thing, but we also were hearing this information about soils and was grazing helping soils. And so when I finished the film and finished being on the road for 3 years with the film, I decided to do more research on that grazing. And what I found was holistic planned grazing, mob grazing, strip grazing, and what we ended up calling adaptive multi-paddock grazing. And it was this way of grazing cattle that made the land robust. And it was just tremendous to be on this land and see things. And it was working at scale. This is a 5,000 head herd of cattle in North Texas. And it was two people in their 60s, a husband and wife team that moved them multiple times during the day, so it's not difficult. And it's all predicated on the bison, who are the best land managers certainly North America's ever had. And so what is AMP grazing? AMP grazing is you break up your farm into small paddocks, and this is just a symbol of it with electronic little single strip polywire. And so you move your animals 2, 3, 4 times a day, once a day. You make a bigger paddock and you go on vacation for a week, but it's very adaptive. And the main goal is to let most of the land rest most of the time. That's the main goal. And as compared to conventional grazing, which allows the animals to roam a large portion of the land, this is the neighbor across the fence from what I just showed you, and they'll let their animals go for 2 or 3 weeks in one of their paddocks. And they eat the grass super low, and then you can't even hide a golf ball. It's so low. Whereas with AMP grazing, they'll let the grass grow waist high, and then they'll only eat half, and they'll stomp the rest. And so what we really found was missing was science. So back in 2013, I was just starting at Arizona State, and I was lucky enough to start meeting scientists who were really interested in this type of grazing, but they weren't getting a lot of love at their universities or their agencies. But we brought them all together because ASU is not an ag university, so we didn't have a legacy of ag funding, so we were able to sort of get things going. And we put together a team, and it took us about 4 years to design and fundraise. And what we decided we wanted to study was about these metrics, these biological metrics of soil carbon, soil nitrogen, water infiltration, microbial life, the bugs above and below ground, the forage, how much forage, the nutrient density of the forage, birds, grassland birds as an indicator species for wildlife, greenhouse gas cycling, methane, nitrous oxide, and CO2, and then animal well-being and the farmer well-being. So that's what we were doing there. And my kids. They're now in high school. So what we did was we did a huge outreach to find the adaptive farmers, and through that we found 5 in the southeast U.S. And then we asked their neighbors, the neighbors who had the same soil type, would you allow us to do all this research we're doing on your adaptive neighbor's side? Would you allow us to do that on your side as well? And all 5 said yes, although there were a few discussions about dogs and guns before that happened. Let me just make sure. And so when we just back of the envelope, just sort of think about how much grazing land there is on Earth, it's 3.5 billion hectares. And so if you were able to draw down 1 ton of carbon into all those hectares, again, back of the envelope, best case scenario, huge task, you'd draw down about 1/3 of all human carbon emissions. That's what that's about equal to. So the potential is huge. Actualizing it is huge, but we wanted to do the science to find out what is real. So our research also included a 4-part documentary series called Roots So Deep, You Can See the Devil Down There. And the first pair of farms were in Woodville, Mississippi, and this is the adaptive side, Cooper and Katie Hurst. And then their neighbors were the Fergusons, Wallace on the left, he's the son, and then Prentice and Margot are the parents. And so we made this documentary. So I'm going to show you some clips from the film, and I'm going to get into data and things like that. And so what I realized was Wallace Ferguson, the son, and Cooper Hurst, they've been friends for 25 years, and they had never once talked about grazing and their neighbors. Like, you're seeing both of the farms in that shot. And so, being a filmmaker and curious and all those things, I asked them if they would get together and just sit down and talk about it. And the one thing that Wallace just couldn't get in his head was how Cooper wasn't putting synthetic fertilizer down. He was taught that that's how you get things done. So here's that scene. Oh, have you been over? Sorry about that. I set up the wrong scene. So this is them talking about their neighbors. Just, will they actually see? Have they actually noticed what's happening next door? Apologize for that. Have you been over to Cooper's this growing season or any time this year?
I had never been over to Cooper's place. But on the highway, the part that's there that you can see, you know, his grass, it'll be 3 or 4 feet tall. Now, in our pasture, the grass is not that tall.
I noticed it from the highway. I know, I watch him, how he rotates. I know where, you know, what looks good and what doesn't. I'm always watching. You know, I cheat, I look, see what's going on.
I don't think that's cheating for him. I think he'd be glad to find out you were looking, to be honest.
He does a good job.
And so again, Cooper doing the amp grazing, Wallace, who you just heard, doing the conventional grazing. So now here's the scene where they had never spoken before about this after a 25-year friendship. And Wallace was having a hard time understanding you don't need to put synthetic fertilizer down, that the animals themselves are the fertilizer. What does that make you think? Like what he's saying right there, that's not the way you work.
No, but it's, I understand it. But the thing is, I'm just saying, that grass is gonna grow when you put fertilizer on it. Without putting fertilizer on it, you think I'm wasting my time even planting it. But
everything you're struggling with, we've been there. So you can't feel or say anything that we haven't said.
Yeah.
We've been there.
It's just hard to think of how you could do this without putting it up. I'm being honest.
Yeah,
I'm telling you right now, you know my dad.
Yeah.
He's as good as gold. And you telling him you don't have to spend any more, he loves that. Yeah.
But I'm telling you, Dad would eat it up. He loves the land, he loves the farm, he loves his cattle.
But you know, if you're not spending money wastefully.
And that's where we are. We are not into wasting money. This much I absolutely know. The more pastures you have and the more you move the cattle, the more grass you will grow. That is undeniable, indisputable, and that's a fact. So you start with your biggest paddock and cut it in half. It's just a matter of start splitting pastures with poly wire.
So one of the things that I did tell you we were studying birds, but one of the things we did not expect was the power of the birds for the farmers, especially quail. So here's a little extra on the quail story as well, starting with our quail scientist, Mike McGraw, out in the field.
Yes, Bob White. Bob White.
They say their name, Bob White. Just delightful to hear that sound in the landscape. From the 90s to 2014, the bobwhite averaged approximately 5% decrease in overall population. So there's been over 85% population decrease up to 2014.
I do know this, Peter. When I was younger, they had quail everywhere. They're not there anymore.
So have you heard Bob White's while we've been here?
Yeah, I have. That when we got, right before we came on the porch, I heard that. And I kind of thought somebody was messing with me. You know, you start hearing things. But I have had one or two 10 years ago.
This year, we're hearing quail from daylight to dark, from front to back, and everywhere in between. It really makes you think. It makes you think.
So I came back there a year later and I thought, I got Wallace. He's going to want to change. We got this. We got the money with the fertilizer. We got the quail with his heart. And when I got back a year later, he had never called Cooper. He'd never asked for any more information. And I realized that the job at hand, which was getting information to conventional farmers, was going to be a lot harder than I anticipated. None of my science team thought that we'd get anyone to change. So that was something real. Years later, we went back with the data from all the science teams and all the research that we did, and we got to share the data with the scientists, with the farmers. And here's the beginning of our data collection. This is the carbon, and I'm showing you folks' reactions to the data.
So for all farm pairs, all 5, averaged out, there's 72.5 tons of carbon per hectare in the AMP side of these farms, and there's 64 tons of carbon per hectare on the conventional side.
We saw about 13% more carbon on average across the AMP side, which is about 9 tons of carbon per hectare. That's a lot of carbon.
People ask how long carbon stays in the soil. It can be days, moving in and out of microbes quickly, or decades, getting trapped in dead roots, or centuries. The dead microbes are made of carbon and take centuries to decompose.
And so with the microbes themselves, there was 25% more and more active microbes on the adaptive side than the conventional side. And I like showing this next little clip because our microbial scientist, one of them anyway, Mike Lehman, he's from South Dakota, so being in the southeast U.S. in July was not his idea of fun, so I just like to show a little grumpy scientist here.
If there was no soil microbes, I think the circle of life would stop. I think we'd all die. Not just us, but everything else.
So the next data we did also with the soil team, and the soil team's actually based at Colorado State, and we'll be at Colorado State tomorrow night showing the whole film, both episodes 1 and episodes 4. And so here's the nitrogen. That's about 9% more nitrogen on the AMP side, but the trick here is the adaptive farmers do not apply synthetic nitrogen. They don't have that cost. The conventional farmers do, and it can be huge amounts of money, as you'll see.
Yeah, I can remember writing a check for $90,000 on this farm one year on fertilizing, and the weather not cooperate, and literally get no growth. I mean, like no growth. And so that was when we looked at each other and we said, don't let any of us get weak-kneed again.
We never fertilized
and we never fertilized, and that's been 5 years. We never fertilized again. I just wish I had the money we had spent over the years, but we did what we thought we knew to do. That stress is totally off of us.
And so self-reporting from the farmers, it was $50,000 a year these farmers were writing checks. And this is before the Ukrainian invasion. So now this number is up to $150,000 a year. A lot of farmers are spending on fertilizer, hoping it'll work. The next thing we looked at, and we have a little result back here, does anybody here know the country band Alabama? Yeah. All right, so this is the bass player, Teddy. And Teddy's an adaptive farmer, and his cousin, Randy, lives next door, and he's a conventional farmer. So this was a very interesting study with family. And so we're telling Teddy about the water here. And overall in our study, the adaptive side got 3.5 inches of rain to infiltrate their soils each hour, and the conventional side was 1.5 inches. So that's why we say the phrase effective rainfall. How much rain is actually soaking in to your land? If we look at that 2 inches of difference, let's break it down. So 1 acre inch of water is 27,000 gallons. 2 acre inches of water is 54,000 gallons. So if you have a 1,000-acre farm, which is not unusual, that's 54 million gallons one side of the fence is getting into their system, replenishing, not washing away their soils, not eroding, than their neighbor. And so this is Teddy's reaction to that.
That's huge. I mean, that should make somebody want to change. I mean, that in itself, that data in itself said, well, I mean, it's quite a difference. Wow.
So on the insect side, when we started, I was told, and I thought of it as ways of pest insect versus beneficial insect. And what we learned was that an insect could be a pest if it's living on a monoculture of one type of plant and it's gone wacko with its population. But that same insect could be a beneficial member of society if it's on a field with a lot of different plants growing, attracting a lot of different insects. And so this 33% more insect diversity is actually a huge sign of the ability for the communities to do their job. And recycling carbon is part of that. And so this was a finding that we didn't expect that clean. And all those insects are feeding birds, and so the birds, as an indicator species of wildlife, is why we studied them. We focused on the grassland birds in this part of the study, and there's a paper out of Cornell from 1970 to 2014, 51% of US grassland birds are gone. And some of them even much higher. And so in our study in the Southeast US, this is what we found. I like to let people read this one. It's a huge difference, right? And then in Kentucky, where one of our farm pairs was, we actually found this. Oh, sorry. So on the overall study, it's 442 birds, the population from 9 species on the AMP side, and 152 birds from 6 species on the conventional side. That's overall our study. Sorry about that, y'all. And then in Kentucky, we found on the adaptive side 31 birds from 5 species and 0 birds from 0 species on the conventional side. And so here we are with Mike McGraw, who will then lead into the Kentucky farmer learning this data.
So it just tells a story of a functional system and one that's broken, essentially.
That's sad. That's really sad.
What makes it sad?
Well, because, I mean, you know, they don't have any place to live over there. They need a place to live. Where are they? They should be there. That's horrible. That is, it's terrible.
What do y'all think about the science that we've shared with you today? What thoughts are you having about what you've been presented?
It's showing things that I've been doing wrong for a long time. And I said, well, I've been making a mistake all these years, you know?
It's not about mistakes. It's just about, hey, this might work better. That's all it is.
What we're supposed to do now. How do we get the carbon back? How do we do this?
So we then chose to let the data sink in. Just let the farmers live with it, not try to be pushy, just let them live with it. And so winter set in. The next spring we went back just to see if they had any thoughts on that data.
What data affected you more than any other data that got you thinking, or?
Hearing that the land is unhealthy because we have not got the species of birds that should be here. That broke my heart. So I want it to be healthy, you know. That's our job, is to take care of it.
So we had 2 farm pairs in Alabama. Fort Payne was where Teddy and Randy were from Alabama, the band. And then down the way is a little town called Piedmont. And I just wanted to give you a little sense of side by side. I've been giving you averages over the whole study, which was how the study was designed, but just to give you a sense of one farm pair. So you've got John Lyons Place, adaptively grazed on the left, and the Garrett Place, conventionally grazed on the right. John's been doing it for about 25 years, first generation farmer. The Garrett's 8th generation is now 6 years old, so they've been there for a long time. And so just looking at numbers and how much the land can hold and produce, the carrying capacity, John's running 135 head of cattle on 93 acres, and the Garretts are running 35 head of cattle on 80 acres. So if you average that out and do the math, that's about 3.5 times more animals on the adaptive side being raised because they're basically growing that much more forage. That's kind of it. Same rainfall, they're not irrigating either side. At the same time, and now we're talking about temporal carbon information. Before we gave you the information of carbon stocks, we just drilled down, got samples, sent them here to Colorado. That was a one-time snapshot. This is temporal. This is over a 2-year period with eddy covariance flux towers. And so even though John Lyons was grazing a lot more animals, he was drawing down a lot more carbon. So this is just the CO2, and now we're going to go into, again, back to the whole study, the 3 greenhouse gases, the CO2, the methane, and the nitrous oxide. And a lot of folks are just focusing on carbon. You're hearing a lot about carbon markets and things like that. If you're not focused on all 3 greenhouse gases, you're not really looking at the system. And so that's why we worked really hard, had to raise a lot more money, it takes a lot more time to get this information. And so I'm going to just play another little clip here about the greenhouse gases.
Our greenhouse gas team was also moving in the right direction, finally getting a good handle on the years of info they collected, finding out if AMP and conventional grazing were sources, warming up the planet, or sinks, cooling it down. Our science, like all science, was evolving. Here was our most current analysis. When we added up all our data for the carbon, the methane, and the nitrous oxide, AMP was a huge greenhouse gas sink, drawing down the equivalent of 3.3 tons of carbon per hectare per year. The conventional side surprised us. We thought it would be a source, but it was a sink as well, drawing down the equivalent of 0.8 tons of carbon. Even so, when thinking about climate change, the biggest bang for the buck was AMP. It was 4 times more powerful a sink than conventional. And if enough farmers choose to adopt it, AMP could be a strong solution to climate change. Farmers could help cool the earth.
So I just wanted to show you those numbers. A lot of people, I used carbon as the number throughout the film series, just one metric. But most of the scientific community, including the scientists on our team, they work in CO2 equivalent. So this is the carbon equivalent. This is accounting for carbon, for methane, and for nitrous oxide in carbon. And then here's the number accounting for it in CO2e, in CO2 equivalent. So methane warms the planet, no one's arguing with that. Nitrous oxide warms the planet, no one's arguing with that. It's just the AMP is drawing down so much more carbon that it's a sink. And we were surprised that the conventional too was drawing down enough carbon to create a sink, although not as strong. Our work is in the southeast US. There's a lot of work that's coming this way. Our team is now in the northern Great Plains, so not here, but north and a little bit east of here. But in the southeast US, just to give another sense of scale, there's 15.8 million hectares of grazing land. And if we got that 12.1 tons of CO2e drawdown across the southeast, that'd be about 191 million tons of CO2e per hectare per year, or CO2e across the southeast in a year. And so again, huge ambition to get every farmer to change. Some people would call that impossible. We're going to give it a shot. But if we got those numbers, about every 5 years and 3 months, we'd be drawing down a gigaton. So that's the scale and that's the potential. But it's only going to happen if farmers want to do it. I don't know if there's any farmers in here today. Are there any farmers in here today? There you go. Farmers don't like to be told what to do. I don't know anybody who likes to be told what to do, but especially farmers. So we hope that we can give data, give stories, and see and help folks change if they want to. And Alan Williams, who was going to be here with me today, but with the government shutdown, his trip to Colorado got canceled, even though the government didn't shut down. They shut down enough, or they were planning on it, so his trip got canceled because he was going to be with the USDA talking about this kind of work. But he's one of the best teachers out there. And so without Alan, this project would never have gotten off the ground. I met him 10 years ago, 10 and a half. And so that's the work. It looks like I got a little bit of time to do a little Q&A. And I, oops. Did you calculate the greenhouse gas emissions from the nitrogen fertilizer? Because just extracting the fossil fuels, processing it. Right. No. So the question was, do we calculate the greenhouse gas emissions from making nitrogen fertilizer, transporting nitrogen fertilizer, and then the emissions of nitrous oxide from using nitrogen fertilizer, much less the washing of that nitrogen fertilizer into the waterways and creating dead zones and things like that. We didn't touch that. Right. It might not be a sink because of that piece. That's a very good point. That's a very good point.
The other question.
Oh, here comes the mic.
It's on? Okay. The other question is, why do you call it conventional? Why don't you call it industrial ag versus regenerative ag or something? Because it's not conventional. It's only been conventional for the past, 30 years since we started creating pesticides. For 10,000 years,
Yep.
What you're considering to be this radical thing was conventional.
Yeah. What words we use are really important. I agree with you, and I agree that I wish it wasn't conventional, but conventional, 97% of farmers are doing it that manner right now, so that's why the word's being used. It really came into play in the mid-40s, so it's longer than 30 years. It's 55, 75, almost 80 years. I'm with you. Call it chemical versus regenerative, right? But we just had to use a word. We don't want to be pushing away folks, and one word could do great damage. So those are the things we were thinking about. And I walked into this as someone who knew nothing about it 15 years ago, and I'm using the words that were around. I hear you on the words, though, very much. Yeah. Here comes the mic. As a chemist.
Do you have the baseline chemistry for all the soils? Were they similar, or does it vary a lot?
No, the requirement for a neighbor being able to...
No, I know between neighbors it's not going to change that much. Overall, the whole project.
I mean, you want to say that, do we measure the entire southeast U.S.? Let me finish what I was saying, because you cut me off. We made sure that the soil types were exactly the same on both sides of the fence, or we wouldn't have picked the farm on the other side. And we did a really, really good job.
Oh, of course.
So that's apples to apples as much as possible in a very, very messy world of doing science.
So my next question is, Site 1, did the basic soil chemistry vary much from Site 5 or 10 or 15?
Yeah, there was definite variation across the 5 sites, yes.
Great, and can we get that information?
Yeah, it's already published.
Cool, thank you.
And it's if you go to carboncowboys.org, you'll see a tab called Research.
Yep.
And then under that's a tab called Published Research. And Mosier et al., that was the first paper that came out. That's on the carbon, the soil nitrogen. Then there's a second paper on the soil health. And we've got 9 papers published, and we've probably got another 9 in the pipeline.
And magnesium, iron content, et cetera, basic stuff like that?
You can dig right on in and get as
thank you.
detailed as you want. And I'm glad you actually asked those questions. The greenhouse gas data is not yet published. That's in the process of analysis and writing. A lot of the other data I shared with you is published. I think we got one more question.
Right here.
Hey.
Peter,
hey, Bill.
thank you very much.
Thank you.
I've been watching you over the years, which
yes, you
is
have.
terrific.
There's a colleague of mine from Arizona State who we met 10 years ago when I got there. Yeah.
Yeah. So could you tell everybody, because you've been working on this for so long, what is the thing that gives you hope, and then what is the thing that surprised you the most?
The same thing. The conventional industrial neighbor was curious about what was happening across the fence. We were told that person thought the other folks were crazy for doing adaptive, something different, something new. But they were curious, and that was across the board. That wasn't just in that one piece that I showed you here. And so that curiosity is a huge opportunity, right? And that's what gives me hope, because I can see how I could see how we could work with farmers to get them to change. And I'm now in the red zone, so I didn't show you the end of the movie, but if you live in Boulder, you can go to the dairy on Tuesday and watch it, because we're screening our film on Tuesday night. Free food at Corita, come watch the movie, and I'm not going to take more than 20 seconds extra, so thank you all very much.
So my name is Pete Vegas. You know, I'm originally from Louisiana, moved throughout the country, out of the country a couple of times. I now live here in Boulder, Colorado. I've been here for about 10 years. So I've been in farming, agricultural projects, food for 50 years. I started as a farmer. I kind of worked my way up the food chain, worked for a very large rice milling company for many years, traveled the world looking at rice, eventually started my own company. My original concept was to cook and freeze organic brown rice so that it can be a high quality product, can be made in 3 minutes instead of an hour, and hopefully move more people to eating what I consider a very healthy product. So the company's grown. We're in most natural food stores. In fact, we're one of the top selling items in natural food stores. We're in conventional stores. And basically, this is a full-time job for me. I hope to retire in a couple of years. I'm a big advocate of regenerative ag. That's where I hope to spend the rest of my career, and hopefully what money comes out of this. So you've all are very aware of what our reliance on petroleum has done to the environment. If you look at any of the books like Drawdown, you'll be surprised to see that, and if you add it all up, food and agriculture is a huge contributor to greenhouse gases. So Peter completely covered animals, so I don't need to go there. I'm going to talk about cropland. The one thing I will say is he thinks it's hard to talk a cattle, grazer into changing. You should try a cropland farmer. That's much more challenging. The grazing actually works. It makes money pretty quickly. It's an easy transition. It's not the same with cropland. But the biggest opportunity to move carbon, especially in industrialized nations, is with cropland, because that soil has been tilled. It's given up a tremendous amount of carbon, and it can take back in a tremendous amount of carbon. But there are also huge benefits to regenerative ag, and you obviously understand climate change. Diminishing water supplies. You know about the droughts throughout the world. You know about the droughts in western United States. The Colorado River's drying up. This is a shot that I took off a New York Times article only 2 or 3 weeks ago. 40% of our underground water, aquifers, are at all-time lows. It took thousands of years to build that water up. We will never put that water back. This is another slide which shows the red are decreasing aquifers, the blue are inclining. So we are totally trashing this natural resource. Well, we're also ruining soil health, which to some extent Peter described that. But we're mining the living hell out of our soils. The organic matter is disappearing. We're also killing the natural microbiome below the soil. There's been a lot of learning in the last 5 years about what goes on below the soil. That's probably the most important thing that's come out of this. People are learning how important bacteria, worms, insect, different types of fungi, mycorrhizal fungi in particular. When you're putting chemicals and fertilizer on this soil, when you're plowing it, you're destroying that. So the result of that is this is the usage of nitrogen in our country today. Now, I'm sure if you don't know, nitrogen is urea. It's made from natural gas, which of course is a huge greenhouse gas. Now, I happen to have an investment in a modern greenhouse, so I can tell you, you can grow a plant in water with nutrients. And that's basically what we're starting to do. We have moved so much organic matter out of our soils that we're just pouring fertilizer on it. Now, in a greenhouse, the plant will take up 100% of the water and the nutrient. When you're pouring it on a poor soil, most of it's going down the drain into our rivers, streams, eventually in the ocean. So the last one is over-fertilizer and chemical use. I think I explained that, but if any of you live out in nature or in the country, you know what's going on. I've been around oceans my whole life. I've watched the reefs disappear. Where I'm from in Louisiana, the tree line around all the farms are dead from planes dropping chemicals on it. I won't eat the fish in the lake that I was raised on anymore. So I'm going to back up and give you a quick regenerative ag 101. Many of you know enough where this may not be of interest to you, but if you go outside and look around, all the organic plant matter that you see, trees, shrubs, grass, is 50% carbon, okay? So millions of years of photosynthesis, plants pulling carbon out of the air, replacing that with oxygen, basically has developed the environment that allows us to live today. Now, you all know that we've disrupted that natural balance by pulling fossil fuels out of the ground where they were once stored. A lot of people don't realize how much of our problem is caused by modern farming techniques. It's said that 25% of the carbon in the air came from our soils. Now, I don't know how they calculated that, but what I can tell you is I've personally seen a lot of land that at one time carried 8% organic matter, that now is down to 1.5%. I know for sure that soil can take that back and even more. So regenerative ag is about trying to restore the health of the soil. It's about trying to bring carbon out of the air back into the soil. It's about growing something on the soil at all times, cover crops. 95% of the land in this country today sits idle in the winter. And if you don't know, there are plenty of things that grow in the winter. You know, even wheat, barley, products like that grow in the winter. So it's about growing these crops and then not tilling it and basically releasing what you just gave up. It's when you till the soil, turn it over, and expose organic matter to the atmosphere, that's when you lose it. It's about not using so many chemicals and fertilizers that you're destroying the microbiome below the soil. So this is a photo I like to show that really explains what this is going on. This is a friend of mine in Nevada. So he grew triticale, which is a winter crop in the winter. Sometime before planting, he terminated it with a rotor tiller, which laid it out flat, like you see, like a tatami straw mattress, basically. He used a no-till drill, and he seeded corn into that. Now, there are people who'll say that's pretty simple. This should be a multi-species crop, and I can't argue with that, but this was his first year. So what you see here is, first of all, that triticale is basically fertilizer for the microbiome below the soil, which needs something to eat to survive, for the plant into the future. It's so thick, weeds will not grow through that, okay? It's preventing water runoff. When you've got a coverage like that, the shade is taking 20 to 40% off the temperature of that soil in the summer. So the water's not evaporating. You're not killing the microbiome. So this is just a perfect description of what regenerative ag is. It's less fertilizers, less chemical, less water, a more nutritious end product. The food that we eat today, does not have the nutrition that it used to have. So these are some photos just to give you a better idea of what I'm talking about. This is a mix of grasses. That's like triticale, rye, oats. But look at how thick that is. Look at how much biomass is returning to that soil when that's not going to be harvested or plowed under. And what you can see here is there's an equal amount of that under the ground, which is even more important because the roots, the exudates that are coming off the roots that the microbiome is feeding on is far more important than what's above the ground. This is another, that first one was in California. This is also in California. This is a totally different type of cover crop. It's a mix of triticale, legumes, some grasses. If you can see way in the background, there's a herd of sheep. He's terminating that with the sheep. Using these same techniques that Peter talked about, those sheep will be in there for an hour. They will mow it down, poop it back, and be gone. And this actually, the next year was a crop of rice. He planted rice on that same field. So one of the things that I'm involved in is I'm funding research projects at the University State Research Facility in Louisiana at LSU. This is our first cotton crop that was planted behind a cover crop, and quite frankly, it looks really good. Our soybean crop was a failure. That just tells you we're still learning. My goal there is to try to develop a simple 3-part process that farmers can follow. What do you do in year 1? What do you do in year 2? So that they don't lose money when they go through this transition. The end result is they're never probably going to get the same yields they do with pouring a bunch of nitrogen on it, but they'll have their savings in inputs will more than cover that. So people that have been successful at this are making more money. And that's what has to happen with farmers, is to convince them that they can make more money. So I'm going to back up a minute. Well, so, you know, there are a lot of other people working in this. I don't know if you're familiar with the carbon underground. I was just at one of their farms recently. They have this device called a flux tower, where they're actually measuring the amount of nitrogen going into the soil and coming out of the soil. They work with Chico State University. They're actually bringing a lot of science to this, which is new. There are very few people working on the science. They're measuring what's happening with the microbiome below the soil. There are a handful of farmers who've done this at scale and proven that out. You're gonna hear from one of them right behind me. You've seen a lot of the movies that have come out, like Kiss the Ground or Carbon Cowboys. Those are great for educating us. They're great for educating the public. But I can tell you, Kiss the Ground has no effect on farmers. I've made them watch it, and they are upset after they watch that film. So these were not designed for farmers, you know. A lot of the videos that Gabe Brown puts out, they're a lot more effective. So now I'm going to get into rice. Now, rice is the crop that feeds more people than anyone in the world. And when it comes to the climate, it's probably the worst crop out there. It's the most challenging because it's grown underwater. And it's really hard to grow anything regeneratively when you're in a flooded field. And worse than that, and I don't know how much you hear about this yet, but rice, because the decomposition of whatever was on that field is occurring below water in anaerobic conditions, it's releasing methane. So rice is contributing to global warming, you know, at a pretty high pace. So, and the only way we're going to solve the problem with rice is to somehow start growing it dry. Now, you're seeing a movement in underdeveloped countries with what they call SRI rice, where they're growing, you know, they're reseeding it, they're transplanting it, they're putting them pretty far apart, like, you know, a foot apart. They're using compost, they're using cover crops, and they're getting fantastic results in terms of yields. They're not having to use fertilizers. The problem with that is these are underdeveloped countries, and they can afford to go out and, you know, with a hoe and clean the weeds out because it's small plots. You know, a typical farmer in Louisiana has got, or Arkansas or California is farming 5,000 acres. They're not going to do that. This is a farmer, you know, I don't know if I mentioned before, but we buy our organic rice from Northern California, Arkansas, Thailand, and Argentina. So this is my farmer in Argentina, and this is a crop of organic rice. And this is the closest I've seen to regenerative rice. It's not perfect, and it can't work in this country because in Argentina, there's a lot of land and it's cheap. So the way these guys farm is a farmer will have 5,000 acres. It'll rain in the winter. He'll collect that water in a pond. That pond is enough to flood 1,000 acres. So he'll have 1,000 acres of organic rice. The next year it goes back to cattle and grassland. He doesn't come back for 3 or 4 years. But during the 3 or 4 years, he's contributing to, you know, an improvement in his soils and improvement in carbon levels. This is probably the nicest field of organic rice I've ever seen. No fertilizers were used. There are no weeds in it. There was no, you know, herbicides used, and the field yields were as high as anything I've ever seen. So 5 years ago, you talk to a rice farmer in the United States, they would tell you rice is an aquatic plant. It has to grow in water. That is not right. Rice is a grass. The problem is, if you put it out in grasslands, it's going to be overwhelmed with a lot of other grass. It happens to be a grass that grows in water and nothing else does. Water is weed control, okay? So what's happened in the South, and when I say the South, I mean Arkansas in particular and northern Louisiana, they've started to move to dryland rice. And initially they did it years ago because Gerber's was looking for rice for their baby food that didn't have arsenic. And if you don't put it in a flooded field, it takes up less arsenic. And what they learned is they actually make more money because they're not pumping the water. They don't have to pull levees. It's a lot less labor intense. And so I would say today, in a short period of time, probably a third of the acres in the South has moved to what I would call dry land or row crop farming of rice. They're rotating it with soybeans and corn. So I took a group of farmers from California who think rice is an aquatic plant to show them what's going on. And I brought them out to several fields where they could see beautiful crops of rice grown row crop. And so the lights came on one of these guys. And he went back to California. He happens to be a tomato farmer. And they grow tomato farms over tape irrigation. The tape is maybe 12 inches underground. It's like drip irrigation. To grow that's what's used to grow most vegetables. They might use, say, 1.5 acre foot of water. Rice is using 5 to 10 acre feet of water. He did this before the rains hit, thinking this might be the only way to ever grow rice in California again. Unfortunately, the rains hit, but that doesn't matter. This was his field when it was green. This is his field ready to harvest. I mean, it's been a fantastic success story. I don't know of another place in the world that's done this, and it's really the future of California because they're going to run out of water. It's just a matter of time, and if they're going to continue to grow rice in California, this is what is going to happen. So unfortunately, this needs to happen on a much bigger scale. There's not enough attention to farmers. How can a guy like Bill Gates write a book on climate control and own 200 acres, 200,000 acres in the United States and not be following any of these practices? And he's not, because I've been on his 2 biggest farms. How can you graduate from a land-grant university in this country that focuses on agriculture with a degree in agronomy and not know what I'm talking about? There's no coursework whatsoever. Chico State's the only university I know that's even making an attempt to teach this sort of stuff. And then you go to universities like LSU, which is a land-grant university that has 17 research plots throughout the state. And other than the little one that I'm paying them to do, they're not doing it on any of them. None of these universities are doing this. So farmers learn from each other, but not that often, as you just saw. They learn from their father. They learn when they graduate from school, and they learn going to these research facilities. So there's a lot more work that needs to be done. This is a small it was started by a grower. It's still a grower-led revolution. Big money will never get behind it. Big money in ag is just like big money in oil. There's no money to be made if they can't sell chemicals and fertilizer. So there's just a lot more work to be done here. Less water, less arable land, growing population, underdeveloped countries that want to eat more protein. It's so clear to see where this is going. It's frightening, and most people can't own up to that. They don't even want to hear about it. So there are people in this room that can do a lot to help. I'm not a politician. There are people here that know how to sway politicians. There are people here that know how to make films, who know how to make a story to the public. But what I'm telling you is the missing piece are the farmers. The consumer, the population can all understand what this is about. But if you don't convince a farmer that he can make money, this is not going to happen. And that's where we need to put a lot more effort. Thank you.
So, in the sake of the discussion, thank you, Pete, for that educational
that was
talk on what's happening with rice and the need for for farmers to actually understand. And Pete, Peter Byck, the work that you are doing with ASU is extraordinary. Also, especially regarding the herd management now, I understand that you also have a farm. I think it's about 7,000 acres, last I heard.
That's about right.
And tell us a little bit about the strategies that you've been undertaking.
Sure. We've been on a long journey, about 18 years of I didn't realize it was called regenerative 18 years ago, but that's kind of the term we're using today. We have transitioned our farm from mass tillage, mass destruction, to total regenerative organic with no tillage. So, and doing this at scale. So we are now heading into year 9 of no synthetic inputs, 0 of any kind. We no longer, we're heading into year 5 of no government subsidy payments. We're not in any government programs. So when the folks say that you can't do this, that's bullshit. You can do this.
So tell us a little bit about, how the regenerative agricultural movement is actually happening in the United States from your perspective.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we're on the verge of being greenwashed out. We need to keep the momentum going, like what you're doing, Chip, and we need more films out there. We need more teaching sessions. That's the next push right now, is teaching the farmers to be able to step out of their comfort zone, because what they're doing, the gentleman that was before did a very nice job of explaining this. It's heritage, it's what they've done, it's what their father's done, it's what their grandfather's done. The last thing you better do is walk in and tell them they're doing something wrong, because they'll politely ask you to leave. So we need to show them that let's take a couple of ideas that maybe this farmer's doing and a couple that this farmer's doing, take them home, incorporate them on your farm, very small acres. You cannot jeopardize the livelihood of your farm. And we have to make sure that whatever the concept or the idea is that you want this farm to try, it has to work the first time. Because if it doesn't work, they're going to come back and say, I tried to tell you it wouldn't work here. I'm never going to try this again, because I've seen it happen. So we have to be very sure that the things that we ask them to try to do differently, they've got good education on how to do it, and not only education to get started, who is the support? Who's the holding hand? Where do I go to find questions when I get into cereal rye that is now 6 feet tall, and what in the world am I going to do with this? So that's where we have to be very, very careful.
They're doing a lot of work down at ASU with Peter. What are some of the other universities? I know CSU is very strong here in Colorado. What's that landscape look like throughout the nation?
I'm probably not the right one to ask that, because I do not get very many phone calls. Now, I am a graduate of Purdue University. They don't much know that I exist or our farm exists. Now, there are a couple renegades that are there, entomologists and soil scientists that care, that want to come out, do research on the farm, just see what's going on, looking at our farm, comparing it to other models. I cannot stress enough the teaching. We had the first time ever inaugural teaching event on our farm this year. Every state in the United States has a soil health specialist. And some states have more than one, but every state has one. We invited every soil health specialist to come to our farm this summer. We had 17 show up. That to me is amazing, coming to Indiana to hear how we're doing it on our farm. Out of the 2-day training event, we got the feedback back. It was the best event they'd ever been to. They learned the most they'd ever learned at any other event they've ever been to. And now the whole goal of this training was to move it to other states. And they all agreed they were going to work to try to get an event like this in their own state. So I think this is exactly what needs to happen. Now, while they were, not while they were there at this training, but about 2 years ago, we had our soil health specialist come out, and she wanted to do some water infiltration testing and earthworm counts and things like that. And I said, have at it, that'd be awesome. I'd love to see what you come up with. Well, and I was a little surprised with Peter's numbers on the cattle, because I really thought that water infiltration rate would have been higher than those numbers. On our farm right now, our average water infiltration rate is 20 inches an hour. Our earthworm count is 1.5 million earthworms per acre. We no longer apply any synthetic fertilizers. We've taken the salts and the acids away. We are in actual, just, it's an overdrive. Our microbial biome is in overdrive. We do PLFA counts every year. We take soil health scores. We take aggregate stability. Our aggregate stability now is about 12 inches deep. What that means is that the soil is creating the aggregates, and you can only create aggregates when you stop tilling, and we're now at about 12 inches deep. So when you think about the soil as a living, breathing organism, because that's what it is, and now that we have aggregate stability that's 12 inches deep, think of the water holding capacity we have, think of the oxygen and the sugars that we can put into those pores, because that's what it's all about. I'm not a biologist, I'm not a chemist, but I do know that you need to have green plants growing, and you need to maximize photosynthesis, which maximizes the amount of oxygen and the amount of sugar being pumped into the ground. That's as simple as I can make it, and that's all the more difficult it needs to be. There are people that are expert. I think the lady here is a chemist. Let her tell us how the chemistry works. I just understand that we need to maximize photosynthesis. And also, another thing that we really strive on is, since we don't use any synthetic inputs, is we need to grow our own oxygen. Right now, Chip, we are breathing about 78% nitrogen right now. If we were to walk outside and go out into the countryside, above every acre of ground sits between 20 and 30,000 tons of nitrogen. 20,000 tons. We only need about 100 to raise a corn crop to do it effectively and being a steward of the land. I mean, I know people that put on way more amounts than 100 pounds of nitrogen. But the point is, we can capture this free nitrogen through these cover crop packages that include legumes. They fix the nitrogen, and we have shown that we can fix upwards of 250 pounds of nitrogen with certain legumes.
Let's talk a little bit about your farm here, and I want to save some time to go to Q&A. So, but the 7,000 acres now, what crops are you actually growing, and how have you seen the change since you went into the regenerative?
That's a good question. Corn, soybeans, wheat, alfalfa, peas, buckwheat, milo, cover crops, cattle, and sheep. So when you think about this, you start to begin to realize how inefficient monocrops are. Like corn is a monocrop. That's the only thing growing in that field. So what we've found, Chip, is we are now commingling cash crops together, growing them together, seeking out the synergies they have, and then you have to find your buyer at the end of the day. So let's talk about two examples. Let's say we've got a buyer that doesn't care if peas and wheat are mixed together. So we will take those to maturity, harvest them, and then that will be supplied to that buyer as a mixture. You're raising the protein content of the pea, you're raising the nutrient density of the wheat. Everything is a win-win. Now let's say now you've got a buyer that doesn't want to have those commingled. So what we have done, we've vertically integrated here. We are now cleaning our own crops. So we are raising peas and wheat together, clean the two, separate them, sell the peas over here and sell the wheat over there. Now, to really answer your question, corn hates our system right now. I do not have the corn figured out because corn does not like competition. We can raise enough fuel to raise corn, but corn does not like the competition. It wants a clean slate, and I And on the farm, we are trying everything we can to not do tillage, because tillage destroys the microbial biome, and now you're losing everything that we've gained over the last 15 or 16 years.
That was my next question. You're really focusing on no-till. So on the corn side, is that a valuable crop that you miss then?
No. I mean, some people are going to say, well, we've got to feed the world. Will our system feed the world? Probably not today. It's not close enough today, but we're trying everything we possibly can. We're never going back. I mean, my wife Carol is with me today. This is way more than farming. This is about building soil health and building human health. We don't think about building human health enough. Everybody wants to talk about increasing nutrient density, and I'm all for that. I totally agree. But there's another side of the human health. Let's think about the farmer here. We have been asked to use chemicals that have the skull and crossbones on them. That's death. Why in the world should we be allowed to live in this world? So we do not want to live in that world. Are we going to ever break a yield record again? No. I hope we never do. We are not farming for yield. We are farming for profitability. And that's what we do on our farm. I mean, right now, Chip, a farm our size, we are averaging right now about $2.7 million savings annually of input costs. $2.7 million. So now when you look at the math on the backside of the equation, you don't need a lot of yield to be profitable. So we focus more on diversity, building soil health, building human health, and trying to maximize the profitability per acre.
Okay, I got two more questions, and I want to go to the audience. The first one is, we're talking about carbon sequestration. Hunter Levins made a comment earlier about how much regenerative agriculture could actually pull out of the atmosphere, and she's talking in terms of gigatons. Now, from your perspective, is that right? Because you have to also talk about all the other farmers in the world outside of the United States, if we could get that conversion rate in the right numbers here in the U.S.
Yeah, I totally agree with those numbers, but here's what I would like to throw out for everyone to kind of think about. I think what we need to ask ourselves is, what does success look like? Do you think success is going to require 100% of this to be regenerative farming? I don't think that's possible. So we can't expect that. In my opinion, I think success looks like 40 to 50%. If you could get 40 or 50% of the farmland to farm in a regenerative manner, using cover crops, stopping tillage, massively reducing inputs, if not stopping inputs, think of the change we could create around the world if you just changed 50% of the farm ground. That's the way. Now, maybe that's too simplistic, and maybe that puts barriers on things, but we have to understand that I don't read a lot of books, but I've read a few, and Malcolm Gladwell's got a book called Tipping Point, and if you folks have never read it, you should read it. It only takes about 11% to tip it. That's it. So, and I see that because the things that we don't try to do, Chip, is we don't try to shove our farming methods down anybody's throat. And we just do our thing, we teach, we preach, and we do all these things we do, and then people show up. A validation we had this year got a phone call from a local farmer, farms over 50,000 acres. Hey, Rick, you got an hour to meet me? I want to learn about cover crops and no-till. Well, why in the world would you want to do that? Because I see change coming, and I want to be in front of it, not behind it.
Right, well, cool. So you are a small family farmer, right?
Yeah.
Okay, how many others are there in the United States? Do we have any numbers on that?
No, I don't. I don't know that. Somebody? Anybody? 10,000. 10,000? Okay.
So 10,000 small, quote unquote, small.
And what's small mean? 5,000 or less? Is it 5,000 or less? 2,500 or less? 2,500 or less? 10,000? That's okay.
So you're not a small family farmer.
We're probably middle.
Okay. And we know we're losing them, and we know that there's a lot of reasons behind that, but mostly that it just can't make a living competing against the big ag, right? And so as this whole movement has taken off with the regenerative agriculture, community-supported agriculture popping up everywhere, how do you see the next, 5 years playing out here?
Yeah, next 5 years, again, I think that the foundation has been laid, okay? I think what we really need next is the next big push of teachers. We need the teachers teaching the teachers so they can go out and make sure that this farmer group is going to succeed at what it is, whatever it is they're trying to do. And we got to remember about context here. Louisiana farmers are going to farm way different than the Iowa farmers do. So we've got to understand that. And we have to understand that we probably, I think what should happen, if you want, I'll just give you my idea. I think the United States, and let's just stay here in the United States for right now, it needs to be regionalized. And I think you can make it into 9 regions. And each region needs an ambassador, one person that's in charge of the applying the principles of soil health. If you don't know what they are, there's 6 of them. Look them up when you got a minute. Principles of soil health. And you need a body that sits at the top of maybe 4 people that are monitoring what these ambassadors are doing in each region. And then you can, once you understand the way each region needs to farm, then when the carbon markets are truly ready to come to the table for the farmer, now you've got a system that's already in place that's regionalized, because the soils in Arizona do not have near the carbon that the soils in Iowa do, so they cannot be on the same page. But yet, if you make it so that it becomes in balance, then things start to work and make sense for the future.
Excellent. Well, it sounds like we're moving in the right direction, at least for now. Okay, let's go to the audience. Who's got a burning question out here? Well, I want to go to Dan here. He's the youngest guy in the crowd. So let's hear what the future not the future generation, but the younger generation is concerned about. Go ahead. Could you get a microphone, please? Here. Thank you.
If you don't mind, tell me where you're from, please. That kind of helps me.
Sure. Is it working? Yeah. Yes, thank you both. I'm from New Jersey.
Okay.
My question is, when you're alternating between a primary crop and a cover crop, and when you go to terminate your cover crop, like let's say you use goats or sheep, obviously that wouldn't kill the root system. So how do you prevent that from resprouting during the duration that you're growing your cash crop?
Great question.
Thank you.
You have to decide what your termination end game is, okay? Ours is no tillage and no chemistry. So we are using a lot of annual species that will be included in the cocktail of a species that will winter kill. That means a species that would get to freezing or below will terminate that species. So when you use an annual like cereal rye, you can terminate cereal rye with a roller crimper. At the right time of its growth cycle, it's when it's dropping pollen or at anthesis, you roll it with the crimper, it goes flat. The gentleman had a picture of it prior. That creates this biomass, this thatch, this mulch, whatever you want to call it. It's about, depending on how well you had, we're getting somewhere of 12 to 14,000 pounds of biomass. That will suppress weeds for most of the growing season. So to answer your question, we don't use very many perennials that the sheep and the cattle are going to eat on, because we cannot terminate those. So you have to understand what your termination is. Now, he had also shown in there, it was a very good presentation, you can break, and if there's any grazers in here, I'm sorry, you got to break the rules sometimes, but if you overgraze and take it down to the ground like he's talking about, you can terminate certain perennials at the right time by overgrazing. And that's not the proper way to graze, but if you've got a field that's coming out of grazing and going to go into row crop, that's what you would do.
Thank you very much.
Okay, one here and then one more. We'll go to Pete for the last one. Okay, go ahead, Bill.
Am I on? There we go. I'm from Madison, Wisconsin.
All right.
Yeah. I'm wondering whether county extension agents would be good teachers, whether that network could be valuable, and how well schooled that network is in regenerative agriculture.
That's a great question. I'm going to also give your state a big plug here in just a second. This is from Madison, Wisconsin. We had a training last year also of DCs, which is the acronym for district conservationist. Every county has a DC, okay, and they're affiliated with typically the land grant university of that state. Okay, we had 50 kids, and I'm going to call them kids because they were 23 to 27. 50. I asked them one question at the beginning. How many folks in here have an ag background? You know how many hands went up in the air? 0. Talk about being thrown to the wolves. You are exactly correct. That teaching needs to happen yesterday. Because that farmer walks in the door, what is that crazy guy down the road doing down here? Can somebody in this office tell me what that guy's doing? And they need to be able to have those conversations with that farmer. Yes, that is extremely critical. Now, here's the plug for your state. Wisconsin has, last I knew, I think you're up to 50 now. You have 50 farmer-led groups in your state. It's the only state that I know of that has that many. There are other states that have some farmer-led groups, but nothing like yours. It's incredible. And they have conferences, they have guest speakers come in, they have teaching events. It's a great model to look after. So be proud to be from Wisconsin.
Okay, we're out of time, but we'll go one here with Pete. You'll have the last question, and then we're going to go to the next panel.
So I really think about how we can move this quickly. And one comment I would make is you probably own most of your own land, right?
We own a little over half of it.
Right. So you have the ability to think long term, and you're adding value to your land. Unfortunately, so much of the land in the country today is tenant farmed. And I tell you, I've been on Bill Gates' farm. He will not sign a contract for more than 1 year. Those people are never going to think like this. And then my question is, in terms of thinking how to move quickly, you mentioned you have sheep and cattle. Gabe Brown has sheep and cattle. I personally think it's a waste of time talking to a farmer that grows 5,000, 10,000 acres of a row crop to convince him to run cattle up. So I don't even have that conversation.
Yeah, we don't have that conversation either. Yeah. If we're going to try to move a farm that size, it's row crops only. Let's try to get a cereal grain in the mix and then set up. The ultimate goal was to set up a timing event to plant a cover crop that's going to help the next cash crop. That's the only thing we can do with some of these guys. But I know we're out of time, Chip. But typically, and this is with anybody in the room. If you go out and just try something a little bit different, and then you say, wow, that's maybe changing my diet and getting a little healthier is not that bad of a deal. You slowly start to all of a sudden, over time, you were all in. And you see the same thing with these. If you could just get them to start a few acres, they're going to say, wow, why didn't I do this 10 years ago? I see it all the time. But I'm with you, though. There's a lot of one-year contracts out there, but they've been doing them for 25 years. Not all of them, but some of them. Chip, thanks for having me.
Hey, thanks, Rick. Thanks for coming by. And let's give a big hand for the family farmers, can we?